So this is the second session on the menstrual cycle, and so far we've looked at the hormones, and we've understood that menstrual cycle takes place in the ovary and the uterus side by side. And in the ovary, the entire menstrual cycle is completed in two steps: follicular phase, luteal phase. And in the uterus, the menstrual cycle takes place in three stages: the menstrual phase, the proliferative, and the secretory phase. We've also understood the different, I've also introduced you to the different type of hormones secreted by the brain and the ovary. Very rough, brief introduction to both. So now let us go to we'll go to the second slide, and here is a graphical representation of the various events, side by side aligned. So here in this particular graph, what do we have? We have on the top, we have got something called as the ovarian cycle. So you see, we have a structure here which is growing, the follicle is growing, and then follicle is growing even further. There's a change in the shape, the cells are added, and there is a kind of a cavity being formed in the center, and then we have got this entire structure being ruptured. So the follicle is rupturing, and then we've got something coming out which is basically nothing more but an ovule, an immature ova, and this process is called ovulation. And then this particular structure get transformed into something called corpus luteum and blah blah blah. So what this graph is basically telling us, it is showing us the various changes that are taking place in the ovary, and these are all cyclic events. These events are repeated every 28 days. And where are the days? So here at the bottom we have got days. This is day 0. Basically we can study this cycle from any particular part, but this is where we usually start studying it from for the sake of better understanding. So at day 0, how long is this menstrual cycle? It is a 28-day long process. And in the ovary, there are, as we just understood in our previous slide, in the ovary there are two events: the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So let me show you here in this particular graphical represented image is the two stages. The first stage is from 0 to 14 days, and this particular stage is called the follicular phase. You see, here we have the follicular phase, and where is this phase taking place? It is taking place in the ovary, nowhere else. Ovary, not in the uterus, please. So follicular phase lasts 14 days and it takes place in the ovary. The second stage, at the 14th day, the egg is released, the immature egg, or the secondary oocyte with the first polar body, if you remember. So once ovulation takes place, another set of newer events start taking place in the ovary. So why is this first phase called the follicular phase is something, let me tell you, is that follicular cells are formed. We'll look into those follicular cells in just a little while. So around the secondary oocyte and the first polar body, we got large number of these granular cells that are formed, and they are called follicular cells. And because for the first 14 days a large number of these cells are formed, and these cells also produce and secrete certain things, that's why the first 14-day stage is called the follicular phase. At the 14th day, the secondary oocyte or the immature egg, which is more appropriate to say, either of them, is released, and thereafter we do not have any more follicular cell formation. Rather, this structure which is left behind in the ovary, the secondary oocyte goes out and this structure remains in the ovary, gets transformed into a structure called the corpus luteum. Now corpus means dead body, so it's the dead body of this granular structure, but this is not dead, it is just a misleading term. Corpus luteum. Luteum is a yellow body. For the first time this structure was observed in the ovaries of the cows, and it appeared yellow, and that's why we call it the yellow body or yellow dead body, right? So corpus luteum, but in reality in the ovaries it is not dead. It plays a very important role. It is actually a temporary endocrine gland, which means that this is going to secrete some hormones. Which hormones is which we'll see. And after some time, if the corpus luteum cannot survive, which we'll see why, then it gets transformed into a structure called corpus albicans, which is basically degenerated structure. It is simply fibers. There are no more cells now. All of the cells of the corpus luteum are consumed by the macrophages, the cells of the immune system, and then they are degraded and decomposed by phagocytosis. So the remaining 14 days, the 14 to 28 day period, is another 14 days. This phase in the ovary, when there are no more follicular cells being formed, rather corpus luteum has been formed, then this particular 14-day period is called the luteal phase. And we will see what happens during this luteal phase. Now also then we have got another change. What happens when there are these changes going on the ovary? How does the body temperature change? We are not interested in knowing this, so we'll simply use a darker color to simply strike this aspect off. We don't need to learn body temperature changes at this level. Another thing, now we come to something more important, right? So now there are these are hormonal changes. Okay, these two rows here are describing the hormonal changes that take place during the follicular phase and during the luteal phase. But what type of hormones? So we've already seen the hormones are released by the brain and by the ovaries, right? So there is a specific sequence or a pattern of hormonal change. You see, at day zero, there is very little concentration of luteinizing hormone, extremely low concentrations, and low concentration follicular stimulating hormone. But on the 14th days, there is a sudden rise of the luteinizing hormone and a follicular stimulating hormone. And then in the ovaries, estradiol. Don't bother yourself with this term. You can simply at this moment write estrogen. Actually, estradiol is a kind of an estrogen, so you can use this term estrogen in place of it. Now ovaries are also secreting hormones, and there is also a very specific pattern of increase and decrease of hormones that is seen throughout the cycle. Now every 28 days you will see the same pattern. At the 14th day there will be this rise in this particular hormonal level, then it will fall down, then a certain particular hormone will rise again. So there are these hormonal changes also during the menstrual cycle, and we'll come to the details of them in just a little while. Similarly, inside of the uterus also, changes are taking place. You see, we have already studied that menstrual cycle comprises of changes in the ovary and changes in the uterus, right? Now we've understood, I hope you've understood what a follicular phase and luteal phase is. Now we are going to the uterus. Now in the uterus there are the entire change in the uterus during the menstrual cycle. During 28 days there are many changes, and all of those changes takes place in three stages. The first stage is called the menstrual phase, the second is called the proliferative phase, and the last is called the secretory phase. And now let's go back to the diagram and see. Now if you look into the ovary, the first 14 days is simply the growth period of follicular cells and the release of hormones by these cells. Okay, and then eventually at 14 day we've got ovulation, and after 14 day we've got the luteal structures, corpus luteum. But in the uterus the stages are slightly different, right? They are slightly differently timed. Now the first 7 days, so here let us just take it as this is the time period somewhere here. So this is the 0 to, let's say, the 4th day, and 4 to 14 to, let us say, this is somewhere here is the 20 this is the 25th day, and these are the 3 remaining days, right? So I mean this basically the menstrual phase starts somewhere from here. So what we have in this last diagram, first of all, let us see. So this is the endometrial lining. You see, inside the ovary, if you remember, so we've got the uterus, not in the ovary, sorry. Inside the uterus, I told you there are 3 layers: the perimetrium, myometrium. You don't have to remember much of those two, but the innermost temporary lining that is found is called the endometrium, right? Is called the endometrium. Now endometrium is formed periodically, and then it is also degenerated. So here what we've shown is, this is the endometrial lining, and what we've shown is endometrial lining over a period of time. So just on the close to the 25th day, 26th day, right, close to those particular days, the endometrial lining starts to rupture off. So this lining will be ruptured slightly, right? It will start to be degrading. It will start to degrade like this. Its volume will degrade and become less and less and less. And so this is what happens. And so the menstrual phase ranges from 7 to 8 to 9 days. It's a variable period. Sometimes it's a 4 to 7 day period. So here 3 days here and 4 days here. 4 plus 3 is 7 days. So 7 days, the first phase or the first stage in the uterus, or the different events that takes place in the uterus, the first stage is the menstrual phase that takes place for 7 days. What happens after those 7 days? Once all of this endometrial lining is degenerated, which happens till here, there's a little lull, a little break, and after that, for the next 7 days, we see growth. Okay, and that stage is called the proliferative phase. That stage is called the proliferative phase. And after the proliferative phase, what happens in proliferative phase, as the name suggests, the name simply suggests that endometrial lining will be formed again. And then after the proliferative phase, which basically ends on the 14th day, I mean, for the next 7 to 10 days, this process keeps on happening. And after that proliferative phase, the endometrium, once it is formed completely, the endometrium starts to secrete some liquids into the tissues and inside it. So this is highly glandular, you must remember. Not only it is vascular, which means it is also highly supplied with blood, but also it has got some temporary glands which are secreting variety of biomolecules which are going to nourish the embryo if it is implanted. Also during this secretory phase, which is the third phase, you see the third phase is secretory phase. Once the endometrium has been formed, secretory phase starts. Also during the secretory phase, see here right on top, it's the same time period. So this is the proliferative phase here, right? From here till here is the proliferative phase, which is close to 14 days period. During these 14 days period, even the corpus luteum is going to produce some secretions. It is going to produce 3 hormones, and that is why this stage is called the secretory phase, right? So I hope you've understood the meaning of the different types of phases, the follicular luteal phase and the menstrual, proliferative and secretory phases of in the uterus. What you must remember at all the times is that these events are not taking place in isolation. When a certain stage is taking place, when there is a follicular stage taking place in the ovary, at the same time in the uterus we have got half of the menstrual phases and half of the ovulatory phases taking place. Or basically the entire menstrual phase takes place during the follicular phase, and also during the same follicular phase inside the uterus we also have the proliferative phase, the growth of the endometrium. And after the ovulation we have got the luteal phase happening in the ovary. And when luteal phase is happening in the ovary, what is happening in the uterus is something called as the secretory phase, plus a little bit of the proliferative phase. After proliferative phase we have the secretory phase. So I hope so much is clear to you at the moment, and I'll see you in the next session.